To the book of Esther tonight, and I'm going to try and get a handout out to everybody. I'm not sure. Are those at the back there, James? Is that where those are? Brother Doug, could you help me get some handouts there at the back and see if we can maybe snag someone else to help you? And we'll take a look. We're at the final lesson in our series in Esther. Probably, Lord willing, take a couple weeks to get through it here together. But we've been journeying through this book and getting some different lessons, of course, reminding ourselves about what truth? The fact that God is in control even when the world seems out of control. And it's a wonderful reminder for us because even often we look at current events in our world right now. We see sometimes a world in chaos. We wonder what's going to be next. But the book of Esther reminds us that even when the world looks like it's in chaos, God is always weaving his story. God is always perfecting his plan. And a great lesson for the Jewish people as well as for us, remembering the work and the goodness of God. So as we're getting towards the end of the book of Esther, we're really reflecting on what God has done. The story has already happened. The climax has been hit, where Haman was doing everything he could to destroy the Jewish people, to exterminate them as a race. But God stepped in, and God weaved to his story through the midst of all these things happening. And then really towards the end of this book, you have this reflection of the Jewish people in sitting back to remember the goodness of God, to reflect on all the things that God has done, and to step back and make sure that is something that is not forgotten. So week number 8, lesson 8, we're in together here is deciding to remember. And that's Esther chapter 9, verse number 27. And so I'm going to read there. I'm going to read verse 27 right to the end of the book. Okay, it's not a whole lot of verses, but they are longer verses. And hopefully that'll give us a little bit of a snapshot of what is happening here at this point in the book. Again, the book is winding down, and the reflection in many ways is going both backward and forward of the people reflecting and remembering the good things that God has done. So verse 27, Esther 9, the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and unto them so as it should not fail, that they should keep these 2 days according to their writing, and according to their appointed time every year. And that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. Then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. He sent letters unto all the Jews to 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoyed them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fastings and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. Chapter 10, verse 1. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. Let's pray. Ask God to help us as we look at this together. God, thank you so much for your goodness to us. Thank you for the story of the Jewish people. And thank you as we reflect throughout history that we see of a people that you have intentionally preserved, who you have a plan for, and we can see that even when the world, even now, seems at chaos, that we do serve a God that is in control. God, help us to remember and reflect on your goodness as we look at this passage tonight, and help us to be intentional about remembering. We pray this in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen. So what's the title there of that lesson? Deciding to remember. And here at the end of this book, you see the story of people wanting to make the Feast of Purim significant. That remembrance from that word pure, that was a word talking about the lot. How Haman had cast lots to decide the day to destroy the Jewish people, but how the Jewish people turned that day to a day of great celebration. And of course, this is what they wanted to remember. But what I want you to notice, and what we're going to try and focus on in this chapter and in this lesson, is that this was something that they wanted. Look at verse 27. The Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such has joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail. Let me pause there just in the middle of that verse. And I want you to see the intentionality of these people was that what was about to be celebrated would be remembered for future generations. I want us to think about this for a minute before we get into this lesson. We'll talk about it for a minute together. How sometimes it's hard to pass on significance. It's hard sometimes to pass on how something is special for one person down to someone else. Let's look at it this way. What are some things that you think maybe for the generation before me that might be significant? For that generation, that might not be as easily significant for the next generation. We have some people, maybe we'll hear from the people here for a minute, that are, let's say, 55 and over, okay? If you're willing to admit that you're in that category. What are some things that maybe you've noticed that that generation maybe thought that was significant, that maybe is not necessarily noticed as significant for the generation afterwards? All right? Hun, you're going to admit you're 55 and over? Just giving you a hard time. Go ahead, Mondo.
It's small, but men wearing hats at a dinner table.
Okay. All right. Yeah, men wearing hats at a dinner table. That, yeah, I would say that has changed. That's true. All right. Yes?
Church attendance back then was much more prevalent in society than it is today. Much more.
Okay. Yeah, just the consistency. A lot of, and I've heard that. And to be honest, that's not something I have personally experienced every time I can ever remember. You know, some people went to church, but definitely I would say most people didn't go to church, you know, that I can ever remember during my time. Somebody else, what are significant? All right, go ahead.
Harbor Day?
Okay, yeah, Pearl Harbor Day. Yeah.
Is he 55?
I know, I let him slide. I teased my wife, she didn't get away with that, but I let Austin slide. Yeah, Brother Doug.
I think there's two things I want to point out, and they don't necessarily go hand in hand, but one of the things is the King James Version of the Bible was much more revered back in the day than it is today, and honored and respected, and you know, the perspective of it.
Okay.
And the other thing is that in my generation, this generation, and even maybe one before it, are losing more kids out of the church, out of the true church, the gospel preaching churches, than back in my generation. I mean,
You'd say it's happening more
like
so.
Huge, yeah, it's like a huge increase in percentage of the kids leaving the faith.
Okay.
Children.
It's good, and that ties into what we're talking about tonight. Tom?
I might regret this, but adulthood as a concept. 'Cause
Okay.
in my generation, you could not wait to grow up.
Sure.
And the current generation is like, no, make it stop. Where's my Pokemon? So
There's truth to that, though. I mean, and there was a definition, I would even say, not to completely criticize everyone, but there was an understood definition of responsibility that came with adulthood. Not just once I am a certain age, then I deserve adulthood, right? And there was a statement of responsibility. That meant I need to have a job. That meant I need to be able to pay my bills. That meant, you know, something. All right, Larry.
Yeah, churches back in, say, 40 years ago were flourishing, and now the churches they're being abandoned, and it's getting more and more prevalent in today's society.
Sure.
People don't go to churches anymore.
Okay. Yeah, and I would say across, I mean, you look even Canadian, I mean, you look at many different statistics about church attendance in general or dwindling congregations. It is a very real facet, you know, just of existence, you know. Anything else? Yes, Jocelyn.
I would say the family unit was much stronger in my younger years.
Okay. Yeah.
And there was always a coming together of the family. Well, in our part of the country anyway, especially on Sunday,
Okay. Good. Good observations. I'm learning something tonight, and I'm the one teaching. This is good. Mondo, and I'll come back to you, Tom.
Jackie and I were married in '97, and on our 25th anniversary, we watched the video, 3 hours. But I said, notice in the church and at the reception, people were talking amongst themselves, not one cell phone.
Sure. Yeah. And the cell phone has changed social dynamics in so many ways. And I see that even especially with our young people, right? Tom, are you going on your cell phone intentionally or what? Like, I was coming over to Tom next. I thought it was. Didn't you have something else, Tom?
Just Christmas in general.
Okay.
As a spiritual holiday, as a celebration of Christ. Rather
Sure.
than as, just holiday.
Sure. No, that's good. That's good. Karen.
I think when I was growing up, you knew every person on your street. You knew their name.
Okay.
And when somebody new moved in, my mother always baked a pie as a welcome. And most people don't even know the neighbor next door anymore,
Yeah, I still have some neighbors that I don't know. There's a few that run when you start coming. I mean, they see you coming across the street, and they're like, oh no, I'm gonna have to talk to somebody, right? You bring a pie, that solves everything. I'll tell you, if someone turns my wife's pie away, they have real problems, right? If I bring a pie, that'll open doors. Why am I going over all of this? I'm going over this to help us recognize it is difficult to pass things from one generation to the next. Now look at this. We're just talking the space of maybe 30 years. And anyone that's been alive for a period of time can look at all the changes, all the things that maybe are different. Some changes that people look at and say they're good. A lot of changes we look at and say a lot of those changes are bad. And I just want us to recognize that it can be really difficult to pass things generationally. There tends to be, as I'm saying again today, there tends to be generational divides. A lot of people talk about different generations. You have the millennials and the different generations, of course, of people. I think I'm classed inside the millennial generation by most. But everybody kind of puts people in blocks, and there does seem to be divides between generations, which I don't think is a scriptural concept. And the fact that God wants one generation to flow into the next generation, I think that's what you see in this passage. But there is this reality that it was like, okay, this day is significant to us. Now, why was it significant to them? Why did Purim hold such incredible significance for this first generation? I mean, the obvious is they lived through it. They were there. Can you imagine being that first generation that thought, we might die tomorrow? Imagine knowing Haman, of seeing him maybe walk through the streets of the city where you lived and knew the intense hatred that he had for your people, enough that he put in writing a day to destroy you and your family. And then having this being so terrorizing, and then go from a day of absolute destruction to victory, I mean, it would carry some significance. And we talk about different things. I mean, people that have been through wartime, people that have survived through struggle, people that have gone through painful seasons of their life. There's certain things that carry a different significance when you've personally gone through it that is difficult to pass down to the next generation. And whether those are your kids or the kids of the people that you know, it can be difficult to be like, why is it so hard sometimes for one thing that is so significant to easily lose significance? The shiny edge of the joy is taken off. The incredible aspect of something being awe-inspiring is easily lost. Why does that happen? I'm sure you've noticed, like I have, and people talk about it often, that as we come into Remembrance Day, you noticeably difference over recent years even of less and less people wearing poppies. And I'm not scolding anybody. I didn't keep track, okay? All right? But it is changing. Now, for the generation of people that had people that went through the Second World War, there's a different significance. Mom, do you have a question or comment?
Something I heard 2 years ago I'd never heard before is not to put Christmas decorations up before the 12th of November.
Okay, yeah. And it's interesting, right? Because for some people, and I've even heard certain people like, don't put a pin in your poppy. To them, that's disrespectful. And I guess I'm not saying whether those things are right or wrong other than to say this. there's certain people that certain things have more significance than they do to another generation or to another group of people. Why? Because there often is some personal connection. Often for those people, their father or their grandfather went through the war. There's someone that mattered to them that maybe was lost or something in their family that was changed. But as we lose sometimes personal connection or proximity to a key event, things gradually have a tendency to fade. And so this passage gives some wonderful reminders about how the people of Israel instituted a celebration that was intended to force people to remember, to force people to not lose that significance. Larry, do you have a question?
Back about 40 or 50 years ago, Poppy Day was celebrated regularly, and everybody celebrated it. Well, we've got a generation that came from other parts of the world that never knew war in the Second World War, First World War.
Sure.
And they come over here, and they don't celebrate what we celebrate.
Well, and for some people at the same time, a lot of people, like I know many people in our church that have experienced war, but not necessarily the Second World War, right? We have people that come from war-torn countries, but the Second World War does not carry the same significance when it was not necessarily your grandparent, right? And you're going to find within those cultures, as you talk to people, you're going to find out that they sometimes have their own ways of remembering, right? There'll be certain holidays, there'll be certain days of liberation. I'll talk to someone sometimes like, we're celebrating, our national holiday. And I'm like, I didn't even know it was a holiday today, because it isn't necessarily for us. But hey, there's anniversaries that roll around to certain dates that are significant. Like even Austin mentioned, Pearl Harbor Day, which, from the States, I'm sure carries a lot more significance, obviously, than what even here in Canada, right? So there's these different things that carry significance. Why? Because of our personal attachment to them. So the question I'm trying to drive at as we go through this lesson a little bit tonight is, how do we pass significance? How do we pass down spiritually, all right, the significance of certain things from one generation to the next? Doug mentioned tonight the fact that we have multitudes sometimes of people that are leaving church, walking away from God. Well, why do some of those things happen? And how can we can't stop it. Everyone needs to make their own personal choice. But what can we do to help pass on the significance of our relationship with the Lord? I'll be right with you, Larry. I just want to get this started. So what did they do? All right. We're going to see some important truths regarding the decision to remember the great works of God. The first one is an ordained decision. An ordained decision. That's there in verse 27. The Jews ordained. The word ordained is the idea of a plan, of an institution, of a stick in the sand. This is what's going to happen. We're going to organize this clearly and effectively. And the decision is made to organize it in such a way that this can be remembered. Letter A there in your notes, it was comprehensive. Comprehensive. The idea was it was to try and pull everyone together, to connect generations, and to help one generation pour into the next generation the significance of what was happening. Larry, do you have a question or a comment?
You're not seeing a lot of people going to church anymore is because the gospel was watered down through the generations after generations after generations. And if the gospel now is preached and boldly proclaimed the word of God, God will increase the numbers. God will build his church.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely some truths there that we'll want to consider. And I think more importantly than even us trying to figure out sometimes what went wrong or who that is to blame, sometimes asking the question, what can we do now, right? And I think it's good. We have a wonderful group of young people in our church. It's a wonderful group of young people. And I think every single person in our church, parents or people that attend, ought to be asking the question, how can I make God significant in that young person's life? How can we pour into them in such a way that as they grow, develop, and learn, that they see God is something that is significant to them, just as it's significant to those that have gone before them? Because I just want you to understand that if it's not intentional, if it's not, as we're looking even here, if it's not organized, if it's not including every generation, every group of people, there are things that often are easily lost. I was talking to someone recently who was talking about a church that was just built, and I'm not going to tell you the denomination or what, that's not really necessarily going to be helpful, but they were talking about, this huge church building that was built, and another church group had gone in to tour it because they were getting ready to build their own. And they noticed just that there was very little as far as kids' rooms. Very little, anything designed for children. And the question was asked to the church leadership, why did you have so few kids' rooms? Why are the kids' rooms so small? And the comment was like, we're not marketing to the kids. And it made me kind of sad. It made me kind of sad, just the fact that a church is kind of designing itself around the fact that kids are not necessarily in view. Why is that dangerous? Because in every generation, if the significance of God is not passed down to the next generation, we really are gambling with someone's spiritual life. It needs to be organized and intentional. And I think as you see how the children of Israel celebrated this feast, you see this thing that it's not just for the adults that were there, right? You see in verse 27, it was ordained and took upon them and upon their seed. All right, the children that are coming after, the descendants that are coming, this needs to be remembered. It needs to be organized. And doing so made for the memory and the significance of this day to be remembered. You see, even as you see there in verse 27, the end of it, that it should be done 2 days according to their writing and according to their appointed time every year. These things were written down. They were done in such a way that it was to be remembered and passed from one generation to the next. And that's your next blank there. It was comprehensive, and letter B there, it was written. It was written. Now, written information is sometimes a little more easily remembered. Mon, do you have a question?
What is that actual date on our calendar?
So it would be in March. I don't know what the exact date is. Right towards, I think, early March is when it is. I'm not sure if it fluctuates at all, and the only reason I say that is because the Jewish calendar and our Roman calendar don't necessarily fit perfectly over one another, and there is some fluctuation there. But my understanding, this would usually fall right towards late February or early March is where it kind of lands in there, right? So when Purim comes around, it is a time of, still is to this day, remembrance for the Jewish people because of the fact that their generations were preserved and their lives were spared. It's a significant day in their culture, but it was written down so it could be remembered. And I think we all know why. All right, often if something's not written down, it's often forgotten. You do that for yourself sometimes? I do all the time, all right? You know, that the old saying, short pencil is better than a long memory, right? It's easy to forget, so it's important to write down. And we talked about this a little bit in the last few weeks, but even sometimes when God does something in your life, it's good for you to write it down. Why? Well, good for you to remember what God has done, but it's also good for those that come behind you to remember what God has done. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, it can. I've known different, sometimes grandparents, that sometimes will have a Bible that they'll read through in a year and make some notes and different things. Not for them, but sometimes they'll pass down that Bible to their grandchildren, all right? Or give something to someone to help, someone remember. I hope not that my kids will just know my life was one that sought God, but I hope that if the day comes, the Lord tarries that long, which I hope not, but that one day I go to glory, that they'll find things I've written down that talk about the Lord that will be significant to them. Because sometimes things that are written down do carry significance, right? So when they were trying to remember, they said we're going to be comprehensive, we're going to include everybody, every generation. We're going to write these things down so that they're remembered. And letter C there, it's going to be memorialized. Memorialized. It was according to their appointed time every year. You could just count on, put it on the calendar, this was going to happen every single year. And we have a lot of yearly traditions. As a culture, as families, We have, as I'm sure you do, sometimes we have some silly traditions that go along with our Christmas celebrations, and we kind of laugh at the different things that we do as a family sometimes. But once they're on the calendar and they happen every year, it's like you can't mess with them, Like we have, and my sons are outside playing, so I can tell this story and I won't get in trouble, but we have Popeye's chicken every Christmas Eve. That happens. Because one year we got Popeye's chicken and Noah almost died, right? Well, he got choking really, really bad. And the first thing out of his mouth when we finally cleared his airway was, if I would have died, I would have never got to open my presents. That was the first thing that he said. And it etched in our yearly calendar that every single year, and I'm telling you right now, if I don't get Popeye's chicken this Christmas when it comes around, I will have a revolt at my house, right? Because eventually you count on it that, hey, this is what we do every year. And it's good. You have some organization over your own life. You have some organization over your own family unit. There's certain things that you're going to sit back and say, hey, every year I'm going to remember this. And maybe a day of a spiritual decision, maybe something special or significant for you around Christmas time. And maybe your tradition or your remembrance is going to be different than mine. And I'm not necessarily saying everybody should have Popeye's chicken on Christmas Eve. But I am saying this, we ought to make sure we have a routine that recognizes God's place in our life and something that shows the children and the generation coming behind us that God is significant. And look, think of all these people growing up every year remembering God saved our lives. God protected us as a people. And every year when that came around, it was the remembrance of that. We should remember so many different things. We should remember our salvation. So as we could sit back and remember, churches sometimes have yearly anniversaries and take times at different seasons of church life to remember the good things that God has done. But it's good to remember. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 12 is a good verse reminding us to remember our salvation. It says, "For the which cause I also suffer these things. Nevertheless, I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him against that day." There was a confidence in the future because of the hope in the past. Let me read you this quote. It may be in your notes by Warren Wiersbe. It says this: "It's sad when a nation or a church forgets its heroes and the providential events that kept it alive. How easy it is for a new generation to come along and take for granted the blessings that previous generations struggled and sacrificed to attain. The Jews didn't make that mistake, but established the Feast of Purim to remind their children year after year that God had saved Israel from destruction." Good reminder, there's Psalm 34 and verse 11. "Come, ye children, hearken unto me, and I will teach you the fear of the Lord." And this is a good consideration, because how do you pass on the significance of certain spiritual events and spiritual truths to a generation that has not personally experienced them? Now, some of you in this room, you've learned to trust God because you've gone through a battle in life. Some of you have learned to trust God maybe for finances because God has provided for you personally. But your children, or the children that are coming behind us, have not gone through some of those same struggles. They have not gone through all those life experiences, and some of those things they need to learn, yes, for themselves, but it also needs to be established in their life through one generation passing into the next generation the truths that they have learned and what God has taught them. I found this interesting. I'm not sure if it's in your notes or not, but it talks, an author, Randy Mazzella, was talking about different reasons why sometimes traditions and memories fade. And one thing he said that was interesting is the joy of the tradition once brought has faded. And there's truth to that. Sometimes there's many things that we personally get very excited and joyful about, but sometimes it's hard just to give that to the generation that is coming behind us. So we have this concept, number one there, of an ordained decision, I'm going to stop there for tonight. We'll take a moment here to pray together and then take some prayer requests. But I want us to notice that when it comes to passing truth from one generation to the next generation, it doesn't just happen. I think sometimes churches hope that kids will just come to church, grow up in church, and that they'll just get it. Often it doesn't happen that way. Often there has to be intentional, ordained, organized effort to say, how are we going to take the truth that God has taught us and put it in such a way that the next generation can absorb and remember? And one of the things that we came across, I think we might have a slide for it, James, actually, is that the Jewish people still to this day have a cookie that they use to celebrate and remember the Feast of Purim. And I'm not going to pronounce it right, but you can see it up there. But from what I understand, and this isn't in the Bible, what I understand as far as tradition is concerned, that it's a three-sided cookie because they say Haman had a three-sided hat. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'll tell you this, kids get this. They understand this. They can absorb this, right? And there's certain things you have to make sure, if you're going to pass truth to the next generation, we can't just expect them to get it. You've got to invest, organize, and plan and memorialize in such a way that that child can absorb at their level that, hey, this is truth that is significant and meaningful. Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if every child that grew up in our church at the very least understood that to the people that were around me as I grew up, God was significant. God was not a side place of life. God was not just some add-on to our family events, but it was significant. And investing significance is not easy. Convincing of significance is not easy, but it is something that must be intentional for the next generation. Let's